A few years ago, asking whether the automotive industry might be making a mistake would have sounded ridiculous. Every signal pointed in the same direction. Governments announced deadlines for gasoline engines. Investors poured billions into electric vehicle companies. Industry experts spoke about the future as if it had already arrived. Everywhere you looked, the message was identical. Electric vehicles weren't just the next chapter of transportation, they were the entire story. And for a while, that belief seemed impossible to challenge. Tesla was breaking records. New battery technologies appeared almost every month. Automakers raced to unveil ambitious electric plans. The companies moving fastest were celebrated. The companies moving slower were criticized. The race seemed so one-sided that many people stopped asking questions altogether. Because when everyone agrees on where the future is heading, doubt starts to look like weakness, which is why one company became the target of growing skepticism. While competitors announced all-electric roadmaps, Toyota kept talking about hybrids. While industry leaders promised a world beyond gasoline, Toyota insisted the answer might not be that simple. Analysts questioned its strategy. Investors worried the company was falling behind. Some critics even suggested that Toyota, the company that had once transformed the automotive industry, had become too cautious to compete in a rapidly changing world. At first glance, the criticism made sense. After all, if the future was clearly electric, why wasn't Toyota moving faster? But behind closed doors, Toyota wasn't focused on the same question everyone else was asking. Instead of asking how quickly the world could switch to electric vehicles, its engineers were asking something far less exciting. What happens when that future arrives unevenly? What happens when someone lives hundreds of kilometers from the nearest fast charger? What happens when electrical infrastructure expands more slowly than expected? What happens when millions of drivers simply want transportation that works without forcing them to change their daily lives? Those questions rarely made headlines. They weren't exciting enough for investor presentations or technology conferences, but Toyota believed they mattered. And the more the company studied those questions, the more it began to suspect something that almost nobody wanted to consider. What if the biggest challenge wasn't building better electric vehicles? What if the challenge was assuming the entire world was ready for them at the time? Very few people paid attention to that possibility because the momentum behind electric vehicles looked unstoppable. But Toyota kept looking beyond the cities, receiving most of the attention. Beyond the regions, with rapidly expanding charging networks, beyond the markets where early adopters were already embracing new technology, what it found would eventually shape one of the most controversial decisions in the modern automotive industry. And years later, that decision would force the entire industry to confront a question it had spent years trying to ignore. The deeper Toyota looked, the harder it became to ignore the gap between predictions and reality. In wealthy urban centers, electric vehicles were gaining momentum exactly as expected. Charging stations were appearing. Governments offered incentives. Early adopters embraced the technology. From a distance, it looked like a preview of the future. But the world is much larger than a handful of major cities. Across rural regions, developing economies, and countries where infrastructure projects moved slower than political announcements, the picture looked very different. For millions of people, reliable charging remained uncertain. Electricity costs fluctuated. Power grids faced limitations, and for many households, affordability mattered far more than being first to adopt the newest technology. Toyota saw something that wasn't obvious in the headlines. The future wasn't arriving everywhere at the same speed. And if that was true, then building a strategy around a single solution carried risks that few companies seemed willing to discuss. That realization led Toyota toward an uncomfortable conclusion. Maybe transportation wouldn't evolve through one revolutionary breakthrough. Maybe it would evolve through several technologies working side by side. Electric vehicles in some markets, hybrids in others, potentially hydrogen in specific regions where it made sense. The idea sounded almost boring compared to the bold promises dominating the industry. It lacked the simplicity investors loved. It didn't fit neatly into headlines. Most importantly, it challenged a story that had already become widely accepted. As a result, many critics interpreted Toyota's position as hesitation. Some called it resistance to change. Others claimed the company simply failed to understand where the market was heading. Toyota listened to the criticism. Then it continued anyway. Because while public attention remained fixed on electric vehicles, something interesting started happening beneath the surface. The obstacles everyone assumed would disappear quickly weren't disappearing quite as quickly as expected. Charging networks expanded, but not everywhere. Battery costs declined, but affordability remained a challenge for many buyers. Questions about long-distance travel continued appearing in consumer surveys. In colder climates, concerns about performance and range kept resurfacing. None of these issues stopped the EV transition, but they refused to vanish. And each time those conversations returned, Toyota's position sounded a little less outdated, a little less conservative, a little more practical. Yet, even then, most people misunderstood what Toyota was actually doing, because the company wasn't spending its time trying to prove electric vehicles were wrong. It was focused on improving something many people assumed had already reached its limit: the hybrid. And this is where the story starts becoming far more interesting, because Toyota wasn't chasing a breakthrough that would dominate headlines. It was chasing hundreds of improvements that most drivers would never notice. Engineers began examining every interaction inside the vehicle: how energy moved through the system, how power was delivered, how software managed the relationship between the gasoline engine and electric motor, how much energy could be recovered during everyday driving. Individually, the improvements seemed small, almost insignificant. But Toyota understood something that often gets overlooked in technology: small advantages become powerful when they work together, year after year. Those improvements accumulated, the transitions between power sources became smoother. Energy management became smarter. Fuel efficiency improved, reliability remained strong. The technology became so seamless that many drivers barely thought about it at all. And that was exactly the goal Toyota didn't want. Customers thinking about the technology, it wanted them thinking about their destination. The less noticeable the system became, the more successful it was. But the most important change wasn't happening where drivers could see it. It was happening inside the battery strategy itself. For years, the industry had largely focused on one objective: build bigger batteries, increase range, expand capability. The logic was straightforward. A larger battery meant more electric driving. More electric driving meant greater consumer appeal. But Toyota approached the same problem from a completely different direction. Instead of asking how much battery capacity could be added, engineers asked a different question: how much efficiency could be extracted from less? At first, that distinction seemed minor. In reality, it changed everything, because if a vehicle could achieve impressive efficiency with a smaller battery, several problems began solving themselves simultaneously. Costs decreased, weight dropped, material requirements shrank, manufacturing became simpler, and drivers gained many of the benefits of electrification without depending entirely on charging infrastructure. Every traffic light became an opportunity to recover energy. Every braking event contributed to efficiency. Every stop-and-go commute quietly improved performance. Millions of tiny moments repeated millions of times, creating an advantage that wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines, but significant enough to influence real-world ownership. But this only matters once you understand the advantage Toyota possessed that almost no competitor could buy. Experience. Decades of it. Millions of hybrid vehicles operating across different climates, different countries, and different driving conditions. Every success generated data. Every failure generated lessons. Every generation improved the next. And slowly, something unexpected began happening. What once looked like hesitation started looking more like patience. What once looked like caution started looking more like preparation. And that shift in perception would eventually force the entire industry to ask a very different question: